School. This is CFTheNatural. Today I'm going to give a presentation on the Hutchison Points System. A question came up recently in the forums regarding the point system, and so we thought it would be a good idea, because there are no videos at Grinder School currently about it, to give a brief description of the point system, how it works, how to use it. It's mostly found in Omaha, not used as much in No Limit Hold'em, but I'm going to give a discussion about it today. I'm going to tell you what it is, how it works. I'm going to go over the actual calculation, give some examples, then talk about recommended opening ranges based on the number of points that you get for various hands, and then at the end talk about the practicality and usage. And okay, so what is it? The Hutchison Omaha Points System was developed by a Omaha player named Edward Hutchison in 1997, so fairly recently, about 17, 18 years ago. What it does is it provides a simple means of evaluating starting hands in Omaha poker by assigning a point value to each possible starting hand. Now, it can be used for No Limit Hold'em as well as Omaha, and both high-low or just straight high Omaha. But it's much more commonly used in Omaha. And the reason is that, very simply, is for most of the things that we discuss, Omaha has 4 starting cards versus 2. So the decisions on what hands to play are much more complex because we have, like I said, 4 cards. In No Limit Hold'em, you can assign starting point values, but when you're only dealing with 2 cards, it's pretty straightforward what a strong hand is and what isn't. In PLO, because of the fact that we have 6 possible Hold'em starting hands, there's a much greater challenge to determine what constitute a hand that's worth raising or calling a raise and what doesn't. A lot of people that are just beginning Omaha take a look and they think, oh, well, there's 4 cards instead of 2, so twice as many options. But actually, it's 6 times as many. And as a result, there's quite a bit more challenge determining what type of hands to play. And so that's why this system was devised. How does the system work? It's when the system was devised, it was actually a lot of research was done by a number of people. Hutchinson was sort of the leader of the group. And there was a lot of mathematical and algorithmic type calculations that were used. They examined a number of components to determine their relative contribution to the value of each starting hand. What they ultimately determined was that there were 3 primary determinants to whether or not a PLO starting hand was strong. And that related to the rank of the cards and whether or not they were paired, they were suited, and or connected. So do you have pairs? What type of suiting do you have, and how connected are the cards? Those are the 3 most important. Then they did a regression analysis. So as I said, they used some very advanced math to actually come up with this. And that was done to figure out what is the weighting of each of these factors. How important is pairing versus suitedness versus connectedness? So the final system that they come up with after they did all of this mathematic calculations, it quantifies the contribution made by each of these 3. Now, what's interesting about the system that not a lot of people know, and I didn't actually know until I did some research for this presentation, is that the resultant point total that you get when you divide by 2 is a very, very strong approximation of the win percentage for that particular hand when played to the finish against 9 opponents. As we'll talk about later, one of the weaknesses, if you will, of the system is it's set up for a 10-handed game. So, for example, if you have a hand that has 42 points, that means that hand will win approximately 21% of the time. And that's accurate within about 1 or 2 points. So 20 to 22, you'd be 95% accuracy for that. And so if you think about it, in a 10-handed game, the odds of a random hand winning are 10%, right? 1 out of 10. So if your hand has a 21% win percentage, you're double what a random hand is. And that's a pretty good starting hand. Okay, so as I said, there are 3 things that you have to calculate to come up with the points. And that's the suitedness, the pairs, and the connectivity, or making straights. So let's start with the suited cards. You look at your hand and see if it contains 2 or more cards of the same suit. If it does, then you award points based upon the rank of the highest cards. If your hand is double suited, then you simply repeat the process. So you just do it twice, once for each of the suits. And it's all listed here for you. If the highest card is an ace, you get 8 points. If the highest card is a king, you get 6 points, and etc. on down. And so it doesn't matter what the second card is. If you have ace 3 of clubs, that's worth 8 points. If you have ace king of clubs, that's worth 8 points. There's a separate determination made later because the ace and the king are connected. But the point being, it's all based on the higher of the 2 suited cards. Now, if your hand contains more than 2 cards of the same suit, you deduct 2 points. And that's what I refer to, if you've watched my videos, as triple suited. And that's a bad thing because you're basically holding one of your own outs to get a flush. If you have 3 cards of the same suit, you can only use 2 of them, and therefore one of the outs you would use to hit a flush you're holding. So if you have 3 cards of the same suit, you not only don't add any of these point totals, you actually deduct 2 points. Okay, the second part of the calculation is pairs. You want to factor in the advantage of holding pairs in your hand, because we all know that in poker, pairs are a good thing. And again, it's ranked based on, of course, the strength of the pair. So a pair of aces is 18 points, a pair of kings is 16 points, a pair of queens is 14, etc., all the way on down. And you award no points to any hand that contains 3 of the same rank. So if a hand was 7-7-7 ace, you don't get any points. Because as you know, once again, you can only use 2 of those 3 cards. And so you don't have trips or a set, you just have a pair of 7s, but you don't actually give yourself any points for that because, again, you're holding one of your own outs, and your chances of hitting a set are enormously diminished. Okay, the final component of the 3 components that we use is the straight calculation, or what I like to call the connectivity of the hand. So when your hand contains cards that are capable of making a straight, it's more valuable. And so if the cards have no more than a 3-card gap, then this is the rules you use. If you have 4 cards that are all connected with no more than a 3-card gap, you add 25 points. If you have 3 cards that are connected by no more than a 3-card gap, you add 18 points. And if you have 2 connected cards, then you add 8 points. Now, once you add in these totals, you subtract 2 points for each gap, up to a max of 6 points. So, for example, if we had 8 jack, okay, well, that's a 2-gapper, right? And it's 2 cards, an 8 and a jack. So if your hand was, say, jack 8, 5 deuce. So the jack and the 8 is a 2-gapper. You'd add 8 points because it's 2 connected cards. But then you have 2 gaps, so you'd subtract 4 points. So it'd be 8 minus 4 for a net of 4 points. And the 2 and the 5 are also, so we do that calculation separately. So you do this calculation for every single one of the connected cards that you have. But if an ace is used, okay, then you want to deduct 4 points because it can make fewer straights because it's, you know, it's only can be used at one end basically. So for example, if you have ace queen, that is 2 connected cards. It's 1 gap. So you would add 8 points. You would subtract 2 points for the gap, but you would subtract 4 more points because you're using an ace. However, if your hand contains an ace and another wheel card, a 2 through a 5, you add 6 points because of the possibility of making a wheel. And if it contains an ace and 2 wheel cards, you add 12 points. So if your hand was ace 2, 4, 9, you have the ace, the deuce, and the 4, that's 3 wheel cards, you add 12 points. All right, let's do a couple of examples here. So the hand we have here is ace, queen, 6, 5 suited to the ace. So we're going to get 8 points for the suited ace. We'll start out and do it in the same order that I gave it to you, right? So we have an ace that's suited, we add in 8 points. We have no pairs, so we get 0 for that. Now we look at the connectivity of the hand. The ace and the queen are connected, so that's 8 points, 2 cards that are connected. We deduct 2 points for the gap, because there's a king gap between, and 4 more points because it contains an ace. Now the 5 and the 6 are connected, so we get 8 points for the 5-6 straight, no deduction because there's no gap, and we get 6 points for the wheel potential because we have an ace 5-6, the potential of a wheel. So that's 8 plus 0 plus another 8 minus the 2 points minus the 4 points plus 8 plus 6, 24 points total. This would have a Hutchison point total of, or what they call H points, 24 points. One more example. Ace, king, 8, 9 with a suit. So again, we start off with the suitedness. 8 points because we have a suited ace. 0 points, we have no pairs. 8 points for the ace, king straight, but we deduct 4 points because it contains an ace. In other words, it can only make straights in one direction, below. A gut shot type. It can't make straights up above. There's nothing higher than an ace. We get 8 points for the 8-9 straight, no deduction as there's no gap. And we get 8 points for the 9-king straight because between a 9 and a king, 10-jack queen, it's 3. Remember, you can go up to 3, no more than 3 in the gap. But we deduct 6 points because it's a 3 gap, so 8 minus 6, a net of 2 points there. So we have 8 points for the suited ace, 0, no pairs, 8 points for the ace-king straight, less 4 points because it contains an ace, 8 points for the 8-9 straight, 8 points for the 9-king, less 6 for the 3 gap, a net of 22 points. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about recommended opening ranges here. And there's how many points do you need to open, to call a raise, etc. I want to qualify this by telling you that this is very subjective. These are sort of my thoughts on it, my suggestions. You can look around and find different ones. No different than anything. Like in Hold'em, you can go to 10 different sites and you can find 10 different charts on opening ranges. Okay, everybody has a little bit different point of view. Generally, they're all going to be in the ballpark, but different people have different ideas as to what is openable, if you will, what's raisable from under the gun versus under the gun plus 1, etc. This is my recommendations based on a 6-max game, but take it with a grain of salt. I don't really use point totals to decide. I more look at the hand and judge the strength of the hand based on my knowledge of pot limit Omaha and hand strengths, but this will give you a general guideline. So 40 plus points is a premium hand. It's a very strong hand. It doesn't really matter what makes up the cards that get to 40 points. If you have a hand like that, you're going to open it from any spot. You're going to call virtually any raise. And you would consider a 3-bet or an ISO raise. So if people limp in front of you, you would definitely be looking to possibly ISO raise, whereas a lot of times, as you know, we don't in PLO because people don't fold. If you were in the blinds, so you're out of position and people limped, if you have 40 plus points, you're definitely going to be raising, even though you're out of position. This is a hand that you might be 3-betting. It depends on the situation, the opponents, the exact cards that make it up. But 40 plus points is a very big hand in PLO, and you're always going to be calling your any raise, any person, probably calling any 3-bet. 32 to 39 points is a strong hand. Not quite a premium hand, but it's a very strong hand. You would open this from any position, including under the gun. You probably call any raise. So if somebody raises ahead of you, you're going to call if you have 32 to 39 points. 27 to 31 points, you'd probably fold this under the gun unless it was a tight game, but you'd be opening from under the gun plus 1. You could call some raises. I cannot give specific examples. There's just too many to cover, but it's strong enough to call raises depending on the type of hand that makes up these points. And we'll look at differences in hands with the same points in a moment and the opponent that makes the raise. You can limp behind with a hand like this selectively. Again, you don't always look and say, oh, I have 29 points, I limp. But in certain spots, you would definitely be looking to limp behind with a hand as strong as this. And you could complete the small blind, again, selectively. There might be spots when you wouldn't, but a lot of the time, if you have this many points, you're going to be completing for the small price of a half a big blind. 24 to 26 points, Now we're getting down to hands that are not really that strong anymore. You might open this from the cutoff. That would be about the earliest I would open a hand with this kind of point total from. Again, you could limp behind if you're in late position. Maybe an earlier position if it contained a suited ace, but mostly we're looking at late position. And you would, again, complete the small blind some of the time. It really just depends the specific hand that makes up this point total. Because remember, you can get hands that have a decent amount of points because they have pairs in them, but if they're low pairs, then the hands don't really have that much value. And again, I'm going to go over that in a moment. 20 to 25 points, these are the lowest basically playable hands. Something over 20 points. The only time I'd ever raise a hand like this is pretty much on a button. Not even in the cutoff am I really going to raise a hand like this, except maybe at a tight table or very occasionally if it contained a suited ace maybe. Again, it's a hand you can limp behind in certain situations. We're going to be looking to maybe complete the small blind some of the time, but these are hands that aren't particularly strong, 20 to 25 points. It's the lower end of playable hands. If it has less than 20 points, we're basically folding. We might limp occasionally if it contained a suited ace, and we were saying late position, or it was a loose game where we had some bad players, and we knew that they could pay us off with a worse flush, so it's worth it to put in a big blind, and we don't think we're going to get raised. We might complete the small blind occasionally with a hand less than 20 points. Again, if it contained a suited ace only. If it doesn't, a hand like this doesn't contain a suited ace, I would say you're virtually always folding it. It's just not going to be worth anything, even a half a big blind. So again, these are just general guidelines. As my point of view, I would not call these anything close to gospel. All right, so let's complete this presentation by talking about the practicality and the usage of the Hutchison point system. First of all, how easily and quickly can we really calculate the points? As you saw earlier, it's not what I would call a complex calculation, but it's a relatively involved calculation. Well, like anything else, it takes time. When you first started playing poker and you had to calculate your odds and your outs, it was probably challenging, and eventually it became much quicker and much more automatic. Now, I'm not saying this is as simple as like the rule of 2 and 4, but with some practice, you can actually get fairly fast. You can even have a calculator up on your screen to the side, or a hand calculator there, and you can sort of very quickly punch in the numbers. But don't get me wrong, it takes some time to calculate them. I don't go through the calculation myself. One of the HUD systems that I use when I play Bovada, I use Omaha indicator, and it calculates it for you. So anytime you have a starting hand, it automatically gives you the H points on the bottom. And that's really where the question came up, was there was a member of Grinder School who was also using Omaha indicator, and he was relying pretty heavily on the H points to decide what hands to play. And he asked me about that, and that's where it was decided that I would do a brief presentation explaining what this system is and how to use it. But it's not that easy to calculate it in your head quickly. With practice, you could get pretty good, but I don't know that it's really worth it. I think it's better to just learn what type of starting hands are strong versus what aren't. You know, starting out by using maybe a chart with starting hands and then just eventually memorizing it like most good poker players do. Secondly, as I mentioned before, this was designed by Edward Hutchison for a 10-player game. Most of us aren't playing 10-player games. At most, you're playing full ring, and a lot of us out there, like myself, are playing 6 max. So that really changes the assumptions. Okay, obviously that hands go up in value. So a hand worth 28 points is worth more in a 6 max game than it is in a full ring game. But how much more? I've never seen anybody come up with that exact computation. So, you know, it's hard to say. The algorithm that they use for this, by the way, also assumes that all hands are played to a finish. So it's telling you, for example, if a hand has 28 points, then what it's saying to you is that at a full table, for now we'll just use 9 players, we'll call it a full ring table. At a full ring table, if the hand goes, the hand is going to win 14% of the time when it goes all the way to the finish. But a lot of the times, you know, hands don't make it all the way to the river. So how does that assumption affect the playability of the hand early on? Again, that's just too complicated to really say. These are just things to keep in mind, okay? is that the system wasn't designed for shorthanded games and assumes that all hands are played to the finish. Now, another really important point that I personally wanted to bring up here is that not all hands of equal points are truly equal. And I'm giving you a couple of examples here. Let's say we have queen, queen, 9, 9. Okay, so it's queens and nines unsuited versus 7, 8, 9, 10 single suited. Both of these are 28 points. Which hand would you rather have? I'd rather have the 7, 8, 9, 10 with a suit. This hand can make a lot more nutted hands. The problem with the queens and the nines is you don't have a suit. A pair of nines, if you get a set, is rarely going to be top set. It's usually going to be middle set. It may often be in a very wet board. Pair of queens could give you top set if you make set. Well, first of all, what are the odds of making a set? Well, it's about 1 in 5, a little bit more than 1 in 5 because you have two pairs here. That's still not very good. 80% of the time, you're not going to make a set. On any ace high or king high board, your pair of queens are just worthless. On any sort of connected board, these pairs are worthless. You know, this is PLO. It's not Hold'em, and pairs aren't not worth nearly as much. I'd rather have a connected hand, especially with a suit. Now, 10 high isn't a nut flush draw by any means, but nonetheless, in my mind, this hand has a lot more potential to make a big hand versus this hand. All you can really make with this is a top pair, an overpair type hand, or maybe a set. And your set could be quite vulnerable, depending on the board. Now, here's another example. Again, we use pairs. Here, we're actually double suited. 9s and 8s double suited versus ace, king, 10, 9 double suited. So we have no pair here, but we have some very strong cards and we're double suited. The king and the ace are both suited. They're both 32 points. Which hand would you rather have? I'd much rather have the ace, king, 10, 9. I have a lot of straight potential. I could make a top two pair with ace, king, or ace, 10. I could make a flush, either king high or ace high, so nut or second nut. With this hand here, yeah, I could make a straight, possibly. I could make a set. But again, this hand, if the flop comes, ace, 10, 4, this hand is worthless. Worthless on an ace, 10, 4 board. Because we have third pair and no draw. With this hand, we just hit top two pair. So, now that's just one example, but I'm just saying they both had 32 points, but they're not really equal in my mind. Both of these examples, I'd much rather take the connected hand versus the big pairs, or the suited pairs in this case. So, if you're just using the point system, well, how do you decide? So, to me, points are not the best way of evaluating hands because two hands can have the same amount of points, but they're not really equal in terms of their playability and, more importantly, their nutability, if you will, their chance to really make a nutted or a big hand. So overall, what do I say about all this? I personally recommend using this system as more of a tiebreaker or a backup, not as your primary determinant of whether or not to play a hand. And what I mean is that I don't, when I play, take the time to calculate the Hutchinson points. But for example, if I'm playing on Bovada and it's automatically given to me for each of my starting hands by Omaha Indicator, then what I do is I'll glance down and see how many points it is. And sometimes, let's say I'm looking at a hand and a couple people limp and I'm trying to decide if it's worth it to limp behind or not. And I'll go, this hand is so-so. And then I'll look at the H points. I'll go, 26. Well, that's more than I would have thought. Well, that's a decent hand. 26. Yeah, okay, I'll limp behind. Whereas I might not have normally. But with that additional information as sort of a tiebreaker, a backup, whatever you want to call it, I'll say, okay. Whereas if I look down, I say, it's worth 19 points, or it's worth 21 points. Nah, I'm just going to fold. Same with completing in the small blind. I may look at a hand and say, 24 points. Okay, I'll complete. Whereas if I look at it and it's 15 points, I'll go, okay, that's complete junk. Even though it looked like it was somewhat connected, I'm just going to dump it. So I think it can be somewhat helpful as a backup system or as a tiebreaker when you're really trying to decide whether or not to play a hand. But I believe that most of the time, the Hutchison point system is really not something that you should be using as your primary determinant. You really should just learn what are good starting hands, what aren't, use a hand chart if you need to, and play by position. And just through experience and watching videos and study, you'll be able to determine what is the best way to go. So that will complete my presentation today. I hope that you found this interesting and maybe learned a little something from this. If you have, as always, any questions or comments, please leave them in the forum. And until next time, this has been CF the Natural for grinderschool.com.